Wan Ning Seah is a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Political Science at Duke University, specializing in political theory, and a fellow in the Heyden Fellowship program. Her research interests are in religious pluralism and toleration, democratic theory, ancient and early modern political thought, as well as French political thought. Her dissertation examines the relationship between religious pluralism and regime type, with a focus on how and under what conditions some regimes that do not fit neatly into the category of liberal democracy have managed to sustain religious pluralism. Drawing from the history of political thought and a comparative analysis of the Roman Empire and Singapore, she explores the various forms that religious pluralism can take and the normative implications of this account of pluralism for our understanding of toleration. Her other work examines the concept of civil religion in Rousseau's social contract. Prior to graduate school, Wan Ning worked as a foreign service officer at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore. She received her BA from Middlebury College. Please join me in welcoming her.
So thank you everyone for being here. I'm Wan Ning Seah, and I'd just like to thank the John Hope Franklin Center and the staff for kindly supporting this event. So my talk today is on tolerance beyond liberal democracy, Montesquieu's religious pluralism. So in the between the 16th to 18th centuries, Europe saw a succession of devastating religious wars that was fought mainly between the Catholic and the Protestant states in Europe. And this image here is one of the decisive battles of the 30 Years' War that happened in the 17th century. And this 30 Years' War alone resulted in about 8 million casualties. And overall, the religious wars of this time ended with the establishment of the right of each state to choose their own religion. And so the religious wars really gave rise to the important notion of tolerance. And tolerance as a concept has its roots in antiquity, but is really this historical context that I think brought it to the forefront as a salient issue for states to consider and to try and inculcate. And so my project is on the concept of tolerance and how it relates to different regime types. And I think that Montesquieu gives us important resources for thinking about this question. But firstly, what is tolerance and how has it been understood today? First of all, the definition of tolerance, we can understand it as the forbearance of beliefs, values, and practices that one objects to or disagrees with. And this could be views that you think are morally offensive or just morally wrong. It could be things that people hold that you think are just views that we should not have. But forbearance of these views requires putting up with the things that you disagree with and suffering in some ways the moral, the injustice and the immoral content of these beliefs, values, and practices. And today tolerance is seen as a liberal value. And by that I mean that it's a value that's kind of came to the forefront through the liberal tradition. And this is in large part due to the influence of John Locke, English philosopher in the 17th, 18th century, who wrote this letter concerning toleration in which he made a very important argument for toleration. He grounded toleration on the liberty of conscience, which is this idea that the state and individuals cannot coerce other individuals to believe things that they don't otherwise believe in. And so because human beings have liberty of conscience, John Locke thought that the state and other people do not have jurisdiction over what we actually think. And so because of this, the influence of Locke, we still associate the concept of tolerance and toleration in connection to this liberal tradition, in connection to liberal toleration, as Locke has articulated it. And toleration and tolerance has also come to the forefront, I think, especially today, as a liberal democratic value. It's a value that we associate with liberal democracies. And to the extent in which you can see on the right some of the headlines where we talk about the vital importance of tolerance to the flourishing and health of a democracy, as well as the importance of countering intolerance as a threat to democracy and democratic values. And so I think the overall connection, the close connection between tolerance and liberal democracy is very much something that we consider today, and there's nothing really wrong with that. It makes a lot of sense. But I think that the emphasis on understanding tolerance as a liberal democratic value has caused us in some ways to overlook other ways in which we can understand and conceptualize toleration. And this is one example of a question that I think is not only interesting but important for us today to ask, and that is the question of whether tolerance can be practiced in regimes that are not liberal democracies. And if so, how can we conceptualize this practice of tolerance in relation to different regime types? And I think that it's especially important to consider this question because we live in a time where there are different societies that care about sustaining religious diversity and care about managing the problem of religious diversity that may not actually be liberal democracies alone. These are just, there's a whole range of regimes out there that care about pluralism and care about fostering religiously harmonious societies. And so I think the emphasis on just studying toleration in relation to liberal regimes, I think is in a way a missed opportunity in terms of thinking about how other regimes facilitate toleration. And I think that, in this talk, I want to make the case that Montesquieu, the French philosopher of the 17th century, helps us to think about these questions and gives us theoretical resources for getting somewhere with thinking about toleration and non-liberal regimes. And so the argument I will make in this talk is that Montesquieu gives us an account of tolerance that is sensitive to differences in regime time. And by that I mean that tolerance can take different forms in different regimes, and that it can be practiced in some non-liberal regimes, at least non-liberal in the context of Montesquieu's time. And I want to draw some implications from this reading of Montesquieu, and I want to say that he gives us a more capacious and nuanced understanding of tolerance by thinking about tolerance as something that can be adapted to different regime types. And so here's a roadmap of how the rest of my talk will unfold. First, I'll look at Montesquieu's account of tolerance, followed by my reading of tolerance as a regime-specific practice. Then I'll discuss some implications of this reading for our contemporary understanding of tolerance, and I'll just end by talking about how this fits into my broader dissertation project. And so Montesquieu, we are mostly familiar with him, and he's most well known for his account of liberal constitutionalism, his ideas on the separation of state, and which has been very influential in the development of modern liberal regimes. But I think that Montesquieu is suited especially for our present inquiry for three specific reasons that are not quite related to those famous ideas that we tend to associate him with. The first is that Montesquieu is a pluralist. He thinks about regimes and laws as there are multiple kinds of laws and multiple kinds of regimes. And so he doesn't just have this understanding that there is one best regime or there's a particular regime that all states should try and build in their own states. But he's a pluralist. He's also a particularist, and by that I mean that he is concerned with particular circumstances of each regime. He's concerned by how particular features of a regime, the habits of its people, its context, its history, its religions, how all of this make up the unique character of each regime. And lastly, Montesquieu also gives an account of religious toleration, and while not all scholars agree about whether or not to what extent he really favored toleration, I read Montesquieu in line with the scholars who see him as being a proponent of religious toleration. And so I'll go on to just talk about Montesquieu's account of tolerance. And in this talk, I will bring up two accounts of tolerance drawn from the Persian letters and the spirit of the laws. So the first account that we're presented with in the Persian letters is an instrumental account of tolerance. Montesquieu gives here three main reasons for why he thinks tolerance will always be beneficial in a state. The first is that he thinks that individuals of minority religious groups tend to work harder and tend to be more industrious in terms of distinguishing themselves and trying to make a name for themselves through their hard work and often in difficult professions. And so he says that there's always some benefit to tolerating minority religious groups because they end up contributing to society through their own hard efforts. The second reason he talks about is that all religions are in fact socially useful. They all contain precepts that would benefit society, and so hence we should always tolerate minority religions, because even in those religions that we don't subscribe to, it can always bring about some benefit. And his third reason for an instrumental account of tolerance is that he thinks that the religious wars in Europe in the 16th and 18th centuries were not caused by the multiplicity of religious sects, but it was caused by the spirit of intolerance that the dominant religious groups had with them. And so for these reasons, Montesquieu doesn't really think, at least in the Persian letters, that tolerating religion or religious diversity at all is something that needs to really be justified. He thinks that it's a worthwhile endeavor. And so this is a quote where he concludes that it is vain to say that it is not in the prince's interest to tolerate various religions in his realm. All the sects of the world assembled together would bring him no harm, for there is not one of them that does not prescribe obedience and preach submission. And the other thing about the Persian letters and his account of tolerance here is that Montesquieu also writes that he praises the Christians in Europe for shedding the spirit of intolerance and for embracing tolerance. And here he writes that Christians now perceive that zeal for the expansion of religion is different from dutiful devotion to it, and that love and observance of a religion need not require hatred and persecution of those who do not so believe. Would that our Muslims thought as sensibly on this subject as do the Christians. And so the Persian Letters is an epistolatory novel where he writes in the voice of two Persian travelers, and these travelers provide commentary on French society at the time. And so Montesquieu here is writing in the voice of Uzbek, a Persian traveler, and saying, and having this Persian personage reflect on the fact that, if only we in Persia could adopt the same spirit of tolerance and think as sensibly as the Christians do in Europe. And so here I think that Montesquieu is gesturing towards the possibility that a despotic regime like Persia can share its spirit of intolerance and embrace toleration. And I think this is an early indication of his conceptualization of tolerance and its wider scope. I mean, because it suggests that Persia not only needs tolerance, but can actually share its spirit. And then moving on to the spirit of the laws, in this work, Montesquieu presents a really different account of tolerance. So it's a more selective account of tolerance. And he gives two fundamental principles explicating his thinking about tolerance here. And so the first fundamental principle, he says, is that when one is a master of a state accepting a new religion or not accepting it, it must not be established. When it is established, it must be tolerated. And so this is it's a very strange principle, especially compared to what we just saw in the Persian letters. Montesquieu here is saying that there are good reasons for distinguishing when we should and should not tolerate. And in fact, he's saying clearly that we should tolerate established religions, but we should not tolerate new religions. So it's a very selective account of tolerance, yeah? And the second principle, he says, is that it is very useful for the laws to require of those various religions not only that they do not disturb the state, but that they do not disturb each other. And so these two principles show that Montesquieu favors an intentionally selective mode of tolerance, and that he's also conscious of the fact that tolerance is not, the concept of tolerance doesn't just regulate the relationship between religions and the state, but that there is a horizontal relationship as well, that religious groups within a state have to be conscious not to disturb and offend each other. And so, as I mentioned, this is a decisive shift away from his first account of tolerance in the Persian letters. And the second puzzling thing about this version of tolerance we see is that it's in huge contrast and stark contrast to the familiar accounts of tolerance that we saw with John Locke. That I think Montesquieu could have been, should have been slightly to be aware. It's about the same time. Locke's letter concerning tolerance was published when Montesquieu was born. But it's a very important argument there that Montesquieu is very clearly distancing himself away from. So we should tolerate not because there is individual liberty of conscience, not because people have the right to believe in what they wish, but because different religions might kind of come into contact in different ways with the regime and with other religions as well. So that is something that I think is very puzzling. And the third thing about this notion of tolerance is that it doesn't actually provide a positive justification for why we should tolerate. Just by saying that we should tolerate established religions and not tolerate new ones doesn't actually give us a principle or an account of why established religions are warranted toleration. And so that is what the argument that I'm trying to propose is trying to explain. But first, there are two what I call inadequate explanations. The first one comes up in the text where Montesquieu himself says that new religions are likely to be intolerant. In the quote there, he writes that there are scarcely any but intolerant religions that are greatly zealous to establish themselves elsewhere. And the thought there is that, and I think he's thinking about the missionaries of his time, and his idea is that if new religions arriving at the shore are only there because they have been propagated by people who are very interested and overly zealous in trying to bring these religions to new shores. And so he thinks that these proponents of new religions are most likely to be intolerant when they arrive at the state. They're most likely to be very interested in trying to convert other people and cause disturbances within the state. So that's the first explanation. And the second explanation is put forward by Montesquieu scholars, and it generally comes under the thought that religion is socially and politically useful. And I think this is true to some extent. Montesquieu writes at length that religion has benefits and can bring benefits to the state. It can correct the defects of a constitution. It can motivate men to be better citizens. And so scholars tend to cite the political and social utility of religion when trying to explain Montesquieu. But I think that these two explanations are inadequate because they still don't provide a positive account of why we should tolerate. The first account doesn't, well, both accounts don't actually explain why established religions need to be tolerated, and what is so special about established religions within the state. And so my reading is that Montesquieu is a regime-specific account of tolerance, and the thought here is that religions are selectively tolerated because it's important to consider how religions fit with the regime. And I draw on 4 components of Montesquieu's thought to make this account, and this is a constructive reading of Montesquieu. The first is his regime pluralism, and the second is his political particularism, his sociological account of religion, and lastly, his description of pluralism in immoderate regimes. And so I'll go on to the first part of Montesquieu's account of a regime-specific tolerance. So the idea of regime pluralism is that Montesquieu provides 2 typologies of regimes in which he categorizes different regimes and how and the different and how they differ from each other. So the first typology, we see that regimes can be classified into republican regimes, which include democracy and aristocracy, monarchical regimes, as well as despotical regimes. Here, what differentiates Republican, monarchical, and despotical is that it's ruled by many or a few, and one for monarchical and despotical regimes. But Republican and monarchical regimes are ruled according to fixed and established laws, while despotic regimes are not. So that's how he differentiates them. But then very quickly he presents a second typology where he says that there's actually two main groups. There are moderate regimes and there are despotic regimes. And so with the second typology, he groups together Republican and monarchical regimes into just moderate regimes. And the definition of that is that they are ruled according to fixed and established laws, whether or not they are ruled by one, few, or many. And I think what is especially interesting about his regime pluralism is not that there are multiple regime types that are possible and that are valid, but that there are multiple regime types that are compatible with liberty. And so here Montesquieu gives us two accounts of liberty. The first is political liberty, or liberty in relation to the Constitution, and this is defined as the liberty to do everything that the law permits. And he says here that this form of political liberty is only possible in moderate regimes. And then he goes on to tell us that there is also a second form of liberty, which is liberty in relation to the citizen. And this consists in a kind of opinion of one's security and tranquility. And so you could imagine living in a regime in which there are no fixed and established laws that guarantee the things that you may or may not do, but there is a certain level of tranquility and security that one might still experience, even in the absence of liberal institutions or in the absence of established laws. And so Montesquieu says here that liberty in relation to the citizen is possible to some extent in despotic regimes. So I think here this is I think one of the reasons in which people tend to think of Montesquieu as providing a more capacious account of liberalism, because he's understanding that liberty can be compatible in more than just a certain kind of regime. Next, we have Montesquieu's political particularism, and this refers to the central argument in the spirit of the laws, that the laws must suit the particular characteristics of a country for which they are made. And he lists here several factors that he thinks are important in terms of shaping the regime, such that the laws should be adapted to these factors. They include the physical aspects of the country, its climate, the way of life of its people, the type of constitution, its religion, mores, manners, commerce. And Montesquieu goes so far as to say that laws should be so appropriate to the people for whom they are made that it's very unlikely that the laws of one nation can suit another. And so this is really, I think, shows Montesquieu's, I think is one of the aspects of Montesquieu's political thought that I think is really interesting, and it's this acknowledgement that different regimes have good reasons for their own laws. The third component of Montesquieu's political thought that I think is important is his sociological view of religion. Montesquieu understands religion to arise out of local context from the ground up, and religion to be shaped by their believers as much as the religion shapes its believers. And so there's this mutually reinforcing relationship between the local context and the religion. And he gives several examples. One example is the practice of vegetarianism in Hinduism, and he writes that the excessive heat in the Indies prevented the cultivation of livestock, but favored the cultivation of crops. And so a law of vegetarianism in these sorts of climates are a very useful kind of law, and religions that permit, that require this sort of vegetarian practice is actually very useful. In the Persian letters, Montesquieu also has this view where he writes that if triangles made a god, they would give it three sides. And it's the idea that there's a very close interaction between the people and the religious beliefs that they hold. And in some, it's the idea that religion and religious practices arise out of local context and humanly bound needs. And so Montesquieu here writes, when he warns against the danger of changing a religion within the state, he says that a state does not change religion, mores, and manners in an instant, or as soon as the prince publishes the ordinance establishing a new religion. In addition, the former religion is linked with the constitution of the state, and the new one is not attached to it. The first is in accord with the climate, while the new one often resists it. So here Montesquieu is reinforcing the idea that existing religions within the state bear a very close connection to the regime, such that they can be considered to be part of the regime itself. And so putting together just these first three aspects that we saw, his regime pluralism, his political particularism, and the sociological view of religion, I think we can start to see that one way of reading Montesquieu's account of tolerance is that the laws concerning religious toleration should be adapted to the regime, and must relate to the regime, just as all other kinds of political laws should consider factors specific to the regime. And I call this a regime-specific concept of tolerance, and I think that explains why Montesquieu is selective about, favors a selective form of tolerance. And one way of explaining it is that existing religions should be tolerated because they are part of the regime. And they support the regime in important ways. And new religions should not be tolerated because they are unlikely to fit the regime. An important, I think, part of, I think one important thing to maybe consider is that I don't think it actually rules out toleration of new religions completely. And I think there's some evidence of this in the text where Montesquieu praises the Protestants or the people of the North that retained the Protestant religion after the Reformation. And Montesquieu writes that these people will always have a spirit of independence and liberty that the people of the South that kept the Catholic religion do not. And so here I think it points towards the fact that Montesquieu is at least in principle open to the idea of accepting new religions within the state if they are compatible with the existing mores and features of the regime itself. And one important thing I think to note is that this account of selective toleration I think is a preventive measure. And what I mean by that is that Montesquieu writes that, you know, in some states when they accept new religions, all is well. In the beginning, they find that the new religions do not disturb the state. They fit quite well with the other communities. But as they grow over time, they tend to exert a kind of pressure and disturbance on other communities. And that is when the state realizes that these new religions actually, have a problematic way of fitting into the regime. And so I think based on what he has written along those lines, his argument for a selective form of toleration can be taken as a kind of conservative measure, preventive measure, where he thinks that we should be very careful about accepting new religions because they have the potential to cause disturbance down the line. So that is what I mean by preventive measure. And finally, I would like to point to the last aspect of Montesquieu's political thought that I think is really interesting, where he observes that there's pluralism practiced in regimes that he does not associate, does not think as free regimes. And so here there's a quote from The Spirit of the Laws, where Montesquieu writes that all Eastern peoples, except the Mohammedans, believe all religions are indistinguishable in themselves. Among the Japanese, there are several sects, and where the state has for a long time had an ecclesiastical leader, one never debates about religion. And it is the same among the Siamese. The Kalmucks, who are the Buddhist people of Mongolia, the Kalmucks do more. They make it a matter of conscience to allow all sorts of religion. And in Calicut, India, it is a maxim of the state that every religion is good. And I think here Montesquieu points out that there are different Eastern peoples that have different attitudes towards different kinds of religion, towards religious difference. In the case of the Japanese and the Siamese, he points towards a kind of indifference, where the multiplicity of religion doesn't really, isn't a matter of concern for me. There's an attitude of indifference to the fact that there is religious diversity. When he talks about the Kalmucks, making it a matter of conscience to allow all sorts of religion, I think that goes beyond just indifference. It's a more principled approach towards religious differences. And I think this is the notion that comes maybe closest to the liberal approach to toleration, where you're tolerating based on a principled understanding of freedom of conscience. And in India, in the last line, when he says that it's a maxim of the state that every religion is good, I think that goes even further than just the principled tolerance. It goes towards affirmation, where you're positively affirming that every religion, even minority religions in the state, brings something good to the regime. So just to bring together what we saw from Montesquieu and to conclude, I want to return to the first two questions that we had in the beginning. The first, whether tolerance can be practiced in regimes that are not liberal democracies. And the second, of how we can how can we conceptualize tolerance in relation to different regime types. And I think that just from what we just saw, Montesquieu does point towards the fact that tolerance or religious pluralism, broadly construed, can be practiced in some regimes that we don't think of as liberal in terms of having liberal constitutions and liberal institutions. And the second thing is that I think Montesquieu, based on the constructive reading that I put together, I think allows us to understand tolerance as a particular practice that can be adapted to different regimes, that can take different forms in different contexts. So I think that there are at least two implications of this reading of Montesquieu for how we should think about tolerance today. The first is that I think tolerance can be understood in a more capacious way, and I think maybe it should be understood in a more capacious way, in the sense of that we should be, I think, sensitive to the fact that it can take different forms in different regimes, and that it does not necessarily have to resemble liberal tolerance in the way that we've been used to, I think, understanding tolerance. And the second is that we, I think, can be more sensitive to the fact that there might be other real-world regimes out there that don't strike us as liberal regimes, but have managed to sustain tolerance in some shape and form. And so I think these are the two implications of this reading of Montesquieu that I think we can take away in terms of our understanding of tolerance in contemporary times. I'd just like to go on to speak briefly about how this work on Montesquieu relates to my broader dissertation project. And so in my dissertation, I look at Montesquieu serves as a theoretical starting point for me in terms of thinking about how tolerance can be conceived in relation to different regime types. And then I go on to study two case studies, the Roman Empire and Singapore, as two examples of real-world regimes that don't strike us as liberal democracies and not liberal democracies, but at the same time they have developed a unique and regime-specific approach towards sustaining religious pluralism. And of course, these are two very different regimes. The Roman Empire is an empire in ancient times, and Singapore is a city-state, and contemporary city-state, only less than 60 years old. But I think there's a lot to, learn from acknowledging that there's a kind of pluralism that these non-liberal democratic regimes manage to sustain. I think by studying them, we can expand the understanding of not only the scope of tolerance, but what tolerance actually is. Does it require a kind of principled grounding in the liberty of conscience? Can it incorporate attitudes of indifference or affirmation, or somewhere along those lines, just like what Montesquieu pointed out in his description of pluralism in moderate regimes. So that is what I study, and then that's what I do in the next few chapters after Montesquieu. And then the last thing that I guess I'm trying to do in my dissertation, which I have not talked as much about in this talk, is that I'm trying to argue for using the language of pluralism to describe the harmonious coexistence, peaceful coexistence of different religious groups within the state. And I think I think pluralism is a better term than tolerance, because tolerance, at least so far in the scholarship, has really rose out of a specific historical context of the religious wars in Europe, and it's also been very closely tied to the liberal tradition and understanding of liberty of conscience. And so I think in terms of theorizing tolerance in relation to different regimes in different contexts, I think it makes sense to preserve a certain understanding of tolerance that's historically informed, but also that we can use the term pluralism to make space for other kinds and other approaches towards managing diversity that don't actually resemble liberal tolerance. So that is an argument that I make separately in the dissertation. And so I'll end with this, that I think that there are maybe at least 3 takeaways from this exploration into Montesquieu. The first is that I think there's no one-size-fits-all approach to managing religious diversity. Different states, different regimes can have different approaches to tolerance. It might look like a principled approach to tolerance based on a thick affirmation of liberal values, but it could also take the form of a kind of attitude of indifference towards religious diversity. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach. The second takeaway, I think, is that liberal tolerance is one of several ways for managing religious diversity. And I think what that allows us to do is that we can then recognize other regimes that don't embrace liberal tolerance as nevertheless appropriate candidates for a kind of religious pluralism. And then my last point is that I think pluralism or tolerance, I think it's not exclusive to liberal regimes. I think we tend to think today of liberal democracies as tolerant regimes, and then non-liberal democracies as intolerant regimes. And if you want to be tolerant, you have to be liberal democratic. You have to embrace, it comes together, democracy and pluralism. But I think what I want to do is to kind of maybe separate the two a little bit more, to say that pluralism, tolerance is not exclusive to liberal democratic regimes, and that these kinds of regimes can develop their own practices and their own justifications for sustaining religious tolerance. Yeah. So thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Wan Ning. So now is our time for Q&A with the room, and we're going to have some questions available online too. Is there anybody in the room that would like to start?
Hi, thank you for the talk. I thought it was wonderful. You mentioned some other scholars think Montesquieu wasn't that in favor of tolerance. Could you tell us a little more about what was their argument for taking Montesquieu as that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So there are some scholars who read Montesquieu as being a critic of reviewed religion. In the Persian letters, he satirizes Catholicism and Christianity a lot. He talks about how the Pope is a magician. There are the Christians. He compares the Christians and the Muslims, and he says that actually I don't see any difference between what they do. And he draws a lot of comparisons and says that actually in France, everywhere I go, I see Mohammedism, but I don't see Muhammad, So I think a lot of people read him along those lines as saying that he is someone that is critical of established religion, and he's critical of the church, of Catholicism. But that is very satirical, because that happens that's in the Persian letters. And so I think some people draw from that. Not that he says that there is that we should not tolerate, but that that religion is not necessarily a thing that is positive, and there are all these, I think, other issues that is associated with it. Is not necessarily the revealed truth that people should take it to be, that then should be accorded certain kinds of protections in the state. So I think there are people who read him that way, and then there are others who say that actually he has an account of religious toleration that and his idea of the critique of religion is actually maybe compatible with his endorsement of tolerance, and that maybe, you know, because all religions share some kind of good precepts, it makes sense to tolerate them to some extent in the state. So I think there are people who, I mean, there's some disagreement about to what extent Montesquieu really is for religion, or really is for the Christian religion, and hence by extension like for toleration in the state in the thick form. Yeah. Thanks.
So we have one from online. Excuse me. Thank you, Wan Ning, for this interesting talk about tolerism and notions of liberalism. I was wondering if you might further discuss the social, economic, biographical factors that might have affected Montesquieu's change in perspective about tolerance.
Yeah, thank you. So I think, yeah, it's hard to pinpoint why there was a change in his views, but I think there's a lot of nuance in how Montesquieu approached this question. He was brought up in, I think, the Catholic faith, but he had a Protestant wife, and he was not. It didn't mean a lot for him, I think, to practice the religion. He wasn't like a fully practicing Catholic, but I think it was always something that he was exposed to, and something that was a part of his life. And so there is, I think, when I read Montesquieu, I see him as someone that is familiar with the faith, but has a kind of suspicion as well, and a kind of pessimism about religion. When he's defending him, what we saw in terms of his advice for for accepting established religions and not accepting new religions, that got him into very hot water with the church at his time. And when he was defending himself, he was trying to say that, I think it's not that I'm against Christianity, it's just that I think that God should be responsible for the propagation of the religion and not missionaries. And so I think there was a kind of I think tension between Montesquieu, the religious thinker, and then Montesquieu, the skeptic, Enlightenment figure, and so maybe that goes some way to explaining in terms of the biological kind of component, and I think Montesquieu also talks about. He's also wrote about the Jansenist controversy. I think he takes a very, I think, more pragmatic approach towards tolerance, and it's very much, I think, in line with his political thought, and this approach of trying to find a calibrated way to deal with problems in a way that is specific and coheres to local context. So I think that it could be a factor, just to sum it up, that it could be a factor of the development of his political thought, in which he, because the Persian Letters was one of his earliest work, and the Spirit of the Laws came much later, about 20 years later. So it could be a development of his political thought, and it also could be the religious disputes and controversies that happened during his time that I think informed maybe a more calibrated approach to religious tolerance.
Thanks, Wan Ning. Great talk. I'm curious about, as you were giving the account of the sociological aspect of his account of religion, and kind of his regime account as well, it feels sort of, to me, I don't know, deterministic, or like kind of people are the way they are because of fixed attributes like geography or culture or something. And I'm wondering about kind of how he thinks about dynamism. You mentioned like new religions a little bit, but I wonder if you could expand about that with regime change as well as kind of religious changes in people, or is he kind of like has a conservative outlook where like the function of religions and regimes is to try to constrain changes of any kind?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it depends on how you read Montesquieu. I think there's a way of reading Montesquieu in which he is, I think, sensitive to change in regime and in people. In his anecdotes, just in these two chapters that I'm drawing from, he talks a lot about, as I mentioned earlier, like, you know, when he's describing the instances of new religions arriving, and he does say that, you know, in some despotic states it's completely fine, and the prince thinks that this new religion fits in quite well, but over time problems start to arise, and then it becomes something that one should be cautious about. And so I think based on what I've seen from Montesquieu, I think there is a recognition that that change is a factor in regimes and in people. The idea of, I think, the fit between the regimes and the people, I think is something that has to be judged and assessed over time and continuously as well. So I don't think this account rules out the possibility for regime change or a change in the composition of the state to the degree that certain new religions actually come to the forefront in ways that warrant serious consideration and serious acceptance. Or I think even established religions proponents of that can change, and they can take an extremist turn that would then, I think, warrant some kind of state intervention. So I think there's room to read Montesquieu in this kind of more dynamic way. Yeah, I think that's what I'll say for now. Thank you.
Another question?
Comment about new religion in Iran, roughly 150 years ago, a new religion called Baha'is. I don't know if you've heard of it. That was not accepted within the country, and in fact was viewed and perceived as a serious threat to the existing religion, but thrived outside. In fact, there are many I know here in this country that they believe that, and they thrive. Mm. So I just wanted to see if you have any comment on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think that this notion of not accepting new religions, I think, is the most, I think, problematic part of this account that is difficult to square with. On one hand, Montesquieu acknowledges that tolerance is in accord with the spirit of the times. Like, we have arrived at 18th century, 17th century. We've arrived at a point where we should shed the spirit of intolerance and accept. But then there is this other very calculated and prudential argument that he's making here, which is that we have to be selective. I think that it does not. It is perfectly reasonable for there to be new religions that don't that is perceived to be. I think there's two levels. I think one is whether or not the religion is actually threatening to the state, and the second is whether it's perceived to be threatening. And I think in this account, it might sound as though I'm not arguing for how the state is the one that should. Of course, the state has the hand in deciding what fits and what does not fit. But in the account I wish to draw is to recognize that there are some religions that go against or don't go against the existing regime itself, irregardless of what the state thinks. So I think it could very well be the case, in your case, that the regime perceives a certain religion to be a threat when actually it might not be. might not be that way. And in that case, I think Montesquieu might say that, you know, you're wrong about judging that fit. And in some cases, it might be right. But then that also creates a problem, because if you judge a new religion to not be fit for your state, in the modern account, according to John Locke, we should still find ways to tolerate. I think Locke only has two exceptions for people we shouldn't tolerate, which are the Catholics and atheists. But everyone else, like, you know, we should tolerate, even if they might have other elements that might be perceived to be dangerous in the state. Yeah, thank you.
Hey, did Montesquieu have anything to say about new religions who are invited in as a source of profit, and also scapegoats, such as the Jewish people who were welcomed into some European countries because they loaned so much money to the kings and the aristocracy, and then once the debt became too big, well, it was easy to whip up hatred against them and then expel them out of the country, so they didn't have to pay the debt. That happened under Edward I, and also in France in some cases, and also these groups are sometimes tolerated until they're needed for a scapegoat to, you know, whip up political support for the king, who suddenly turns against a small group of people and says, well, they're the ones who are causing all the strife. You know, it's not the price of bread or anything.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I haven't read as much along the lines of the scapegoating of the new religions that come in, but in the Persian letters, when he talks about the minority religious groups and how they tend to be more industrious, he's talking about the Armenians in Persia, and there the idea was just that we should accept them because they contribute in a lot of ways, and they actually they try to distinguish themselves by an opulence and wealth, and in the hardest profession. So there is a very materialistic and concrete reason for bringing them in. But I didn't see as much about how states could, you know, of course I think he is aware that governments can always use those religions to stir up strife. I think that the main concern was with religious enthusiasts and that overt zeal to proselytize at the time, which causes which destabilizes the state. And when he gave that remark, the church was angry at Montesquieu because they think that, oh, you have now given the Chinese regimes reason to exclude Christianity as a new religion from their state. But then that's where his remark about how proselytization, we should leave that to God. Like, so at some point he comes back to favor the Christian religion as. Of course, I'm not trying to argue against the Christian religion. I'm just arguing that new religions could cause destabilization. So, yeah, I think that's, yeah. I didn't look so far as to see any acknowledgement that new religions can use as scapegoats, but there must be in there somewhere. Yeah.
Time for we'll do the one quick one online and one quick one in the room.
Thanks, Wan Ning. This was great. I was curious to hear if there's a sort of flip side to your argument that liberal democracies are not as tolerant as they might aspire to be, and if there are examples of that you would point to. And then I was thinking about what the challenge of this in a modern nation state in a very globalized world, and if there are examples of non-liberal regimes that practice tolerance in our nation states. And so I was trying to think about China, and China, for example, does allow a certain level of freedom of belief and association among some groups. They've even accepted Baha'is, but others, you know, certain Muslim groups or the Uyghurs have a, you know, very strong persecution or, you know, not allow the free association in the same way. And so that seems to me a case of sort of a selective pluralism that is in accord with the aspirations of the regime and its take on sort of which religions are contributing to the social good. And I don't know if that's how you would see China. I'd be curious to hear. Or if there's any other countries, nation states in particular, that you thought about including as your case studies for your dissertation. Like, which ones did you kind of mull over? Could this be an example of a non-liberal regime practicing a religious pluralism?
Thank you. Thanks, Caroline. So yeah, the first question, well, the immediate ones that come to mind are examples of liberal democracies that are still struggling to foster toleration. I think of the US and I think of France. Of course, they are not the same regimes. They're very different, and they've had different approaches to sustaining tolerance too. But yeah, I think you know, they both still have a lot of challenges in terms of fostering a kind of mutual understanding between the religious groups, and also challenge with integrating the religious identities with the national collective identity. I think in France, I think that's a problem. And in the US, I think as well, we see that. There was a Pew survey, I think in 2019 or 20, that saw, that basically surveyed Americans on whether they see discrimination in the US. Actually, I have it here. It's a bit small, but so they found that, you know, 80% of Americans say that at least some Muslims face discrimination, at least 64% say that Jews face some discrimination, and at least 50% say that Christians face some discrimination. So at least more than half of Americans think that at least everyone, all the major other religious groups face some kind of discrimination. So that's the tricky thing. And then this slide is coming in very handy. And then this is the next, right? So I think when I think of what other regimes really can, that have managed to foster pluralism that is not a liberal democracy, I think the best example that comes to mind is Singapore. Of course, it's a city-state, but I was trying to find regimes that are tolerant and pluralistic in a broader sense. So what's interesting about Singapore is that it has a very more or less equal distribution of the different religious groups. So there's no one dominant religious groups. So Singapore was the case study that I landed on. The other place that I am looking at and will look at in the future is the Ottoman Empire. And I want to, I think that they had a very clear acceptance and tolerance of the non-Muslim communities within the jurisdiction. But then that again is an empire, and so I think that itself might say something about the kinds of regimes that are best suited to tolerate and to foster toleration. Yeah.
Quick question. Your chart 16 and 19.
Yes. That refers to the year. So in between 2016 and 2019. It's roughly equal for estimation of Muslims facing discrimination, but it went up that much for the Jews and for the Christians. Yeah.
So that is all we have time for today. If you want to give Wan Ning another round of applause.